My mom and dad excluded me from their weddings and called me their past. But when I discovered they stole $45,000 from my college, I helped them get sued, and their marriages collapsed. Now they want to fix things. I'm 28 years old. I live in Chicago, working at a logistics company, and like 3 months ago, something happened that basically closed a chapter of my life that had been open since I was a kid. I don't know if it was justice or revenge or what, but my grandparents sued my parents for stealing money that was meant for my college, and everything exploded in a way I never imagined. The thing is, this story doesn't start there. It starts way before. When I was like 8 years old and my parents were still married, but already hated each other with every fiber of their being. I grew up in a small town in Ohio, one of those places where everyone knows everyone and nothing interesting ever happens. My dad, Stephen, worked at an auto parts factory, and my mom, Nancy, was a waitress at a diner downtown. We weren't rich, but we didn't lack anything either. Or at least that's what I thought when I was a kid. What I do remember perfectly are the fights. The screaming arguments that started when I was 8 years old and never stopped. My dad would come home from work in a bad mood. My mom would complain that he didn't earn enough. He'd yell at her to get a better job then. She'd tell him he was useless, and I'd lock myself in my room with headphones on, trying not to hear. But I'd hear anyway, because the walls in that house were thin, and they didn't bother lowering their voices. When I was like 9 years old, things got worse, because my dad lost his job at the factory. There were staff cuts or something like that. They never explained the details to me because I was a kid and supposedly kids shouldn't worry about those things. But obviously I did worry, because now the fights were worse and more frequent. My mom worked double shifts at the diner, and my dad spent his time looking for work and drinking beer in the basement. I remember we stopped going out to eat on Sundays, which was something we always did, and we started eating a lot of rice with beans and plain pasta. I care so much about the food, honestly, but I did care that my parents seemed to hate each other more every day. The divorce came when I was 10 years old, and it was a total disaster, like a legal pitched battle that lasted months. My mom hired a lawyer with money that my grandfather, Ralph, her dad, lent her, and my dad hired another lawyer with money that my paternal grandparents, Lawrence and Frances, lent him. Everything was a war over custody, over the house, over the furniture, over everything. I didn't understand why they fought so much to have me if neither of them really seemed to want me when we were together. In the end, they reached a shared custody agreement, 1 week with each one, but it was obvious that I was more of a trophy than a person to them. You know what I mean? It was like they wanted to win the legal battle but not actually have a son. The next few years were weird and lonely. 1 week I'd live with my mom in a small apartment near the diner where she worked, and the next week I'd live with my dad in another apartment on the other side of town. Neither of them tried very hard to make me feel welcome. Honestly. My mom worked all the time, and when she was home, she was tired and in a bad mood. My dad eventually got a job at another factory, but earned less, and was always bitter about it. I basically raised myself, cooking my own meals, doing my homework without help, spending time with my grandparents when I could because they were the only ones who really seemed to care that I existed. My paternal grandparents, Lawrence and Frances, lived on a small farm on the outskirts of town. They had chickens and some cows and a huge garden where my grandmother grew vegetables. I'd go there on weekends when I could, and I felt more at home than in either of my parents' apartments. My grandfather taught me how to fix things, how to use tools. He'd take me fishing at the lake. My grandmother cooked amazing meals and would ask me how school was going and really listen to my answers. My maternal grandparents, Ralph and Joyce, had a hardware store in town, and they were also great to me. My grandfather, Ralph, let me help at the store on Saturdays and would pay me a little money to buy whatever I wanted. My grandmother Joyce was super active in the community, organized events, and always included me in everything. Basically, my grandparents were more parents to me than my own parents during those years. They went to my baseball games at school. They helped me with school projects. They bought me new clothes when I needed them. My parents only did the bare minimum. They gave me a roof and food, and that was it. But there was no real emotional connection. I knew they didn't care as much as they should care about a son, but I guess I got used to it and stopped expecting more from them. When I turned 18 and graduated high school, I applied to several universities and got into Ohio State University in Columbus. My grandparents were super proud and told Me, they'd help me with expenses, because they knew my parents didn't have much money. I didn't think much about it at the time. I was just excited to leave town and start a new life. When the day came to move to the dorm, my parents came to say goodbye, but it was super weird and distant. My mom gave me a quick hug and told me to behave. My dad shook my hand, who shakes their son's hand, seriously, and told me not to waste the opportunity. That was it. My grandparents cried and hugged me tight and made me promise I'd visit often. College was amazing, honestly. I met new people, had my first serious girlfriend, joined a rock climbing club, got good grades. My roommate, Ryan, became my best friend, and basically was like the brother I never had. I talked to my grandparents on the phone every week, but almost never talked to my parents. They didn't call me either, so I guess the feeling was mutual. Sometimes I felt guilty for not missing them, but the truth is there wasn't much to miss. Then came the moment that basically confirmed what I already suspected, that my parents didn't care about me at all. It was in my second year of college. I was like 19 years old. I was browsing Facebook one night when I saw photos of my mom's wedding. My mom had married a guy named Dennis, a guy she met at the diner where she worked, and she hadn't invited me. She hadn't even told me she was getting married. I found out through Facebook looking at photos of her in a white dress with a bouquet of flowers, smiling with this guy I'd never met. There were like 40 people at the wedding according to the photos. Friends, family, co-workers, but I wasn't there because I wasn't invited. I sat at my dorm desk, staring at those photos for I don't know how long, like an hour maybe, trying to process what I was seeing. Ryan came in and asked me what was wrong, because I guess I looked like I was in shock. I showed him the photos, and he was like, "What the hell? Your mom got married without telling? You?" And I just nodded because I couldn't speak. I was angry and sad and confused all at the same time. How does a mother do that? How do you get married without even inviting your only son? I wrote my mom a message that night, something like, "Congratulations on your wedding." I found out through Facebook. She responded the next day with a super cold message that basically said it had been a small, intimate ceremony and that she didn't want to bother me during my studies. Didn't want to bother me. As if inviting your son to your wedding was a bother. I didn't know what to respond, so I didn't respond at all. But wait, because it gets worse. 2 weeks after my mom's wedding, my dad also got married. To a woman named Carolyn, who apparently he'd met at work. And guess what? He didn't invite me either. I found out because my grandfather, Lawrence, called to tell me he'd heard rumors in town that my dad had gotten married the previous weekend. I called my dad to ask him, and he didn't even deny anything. He just said, "Yeah, I got married, so what?" With a super defensive tone. I asked him why he hadn't told me, and he literally told me. And I remember this word for word because it got burned into my brain. He told me, "Because you're part of my past, Andrew, and Carolyn is my future." I didn't want to mix things up. You're part of my past, as if I were an ex-girlfriend or an old job, not his son. I hung up the phone and started crying. Honestly, and I'm not ashamed to admit it. I was 19 years old and both my parents had basically told me I wasn't important to them, that I didn't deserve to be in their new lives. Ryan took me out for some beers that night. We had fake eyes, don't judge, and let me vent. I told him I was never going to forgive them, that they were basically dead to me, and he just nodded and said he completely understood. I spent the next few years focusing on my studies and trying not to think about my parents. I talked to my grandparents regularly and visited them during breaks. They never talked bad about my parents directly, but I could see on their faces that they didn't approve of what they'd done either. My relationship with my parents was basically non-existent. We didn't call each other, we didn't visit, nothing. It was like I was an orphan, except I technically had living parents who just didn't want to know about me. I graduated when I was 22 with a degree in business administration and got a job in Chicago at a logistics company. I moved to the city, got an apartment with Ryan, who had also gotten a job there, started my adult life. Everything was going well, or at least as well as it can go when you basically have no family except your grandparents who are aging and live 7 hours away. Then like 6 months ago, something happened that changed everything. I was visiting my paternal grandparents, Lawrence and Frances, at their farm. It was a Saturday afternoon, and we were sitting on the porch drinking lemonade when my grandmother casually mentioned something that left me frozen. She said something like, "It's a shame your dad never paid us back the money we lent him for your college. We could really use that money now with all your grandfather's medical expenses." I was like, "What money?" And she went pale, like she'd realized she'd said something she shouldn't have. Turns out my paternal grandparents had lent my dad $25,000 when I started college, specifically to help with my tuition and housing expenses. My dad had promised them he'd use that money for my education and that he'd pay them back in installments. But he never used that money for me. I had paid for my college with student loans and part-time jobs because my dad always told me he didn't have money to help me. And now I was finding out he'd received $25,000 that was supposed to be for me and had simply kept it. I asked my grandmother if she was sure, and she started crying and asked me for forgiveness for not telling me sooner. She said, "They thought I knew. That they assumed my dad had given me the money or had used it to pay the university directly." My grandfather Lawrence came out to the porch, and when he saw his wife crying, he told me the whole story. He showed me the bank receipts, the checks they'd given my dad, the emails where my dad promised to pay back. They had everything documented. And it wasn't just my dad. Turns out my mom had also received money from her parents. Ralph and Joyce had lent $20,000 for the same purpose, and she hadn't used that money for me either, or paid them back. I felt sick, literally like I was going to throw up right there on the porch. My parents hadn't just abandoned me emotionally. They'd robbed me. They'd robbed their own parents, who were elderly people with medical expenses and real needs. I drove straight from my grandparents' farm to town, to the house where my dad now lived with Carolyn. I knocked on the door, and when my dad opened it, I was already yelling. I told him I knew about the money. How could he have done that to me? How could he have done that to his parents? He turned red and started yelling too, telling me how dare I show up at his house making accusations, that money wasn't my problem. Carolyn appeared behind him and told him he'd better close the door, that it wasn't worth arguing with me. I went to see my mom after, at the apartment where she lived with Dennis. She was working, but Dennis was there. I explained who I was because I think he'd only seen me once or twice in all these years, and told him I needed to talk to my mom about the money she owed. He looked at me like I was trash and told me Nancy wasn't there, and to leave. I waited in my car until my mom came home from her shift at the diner, like at 10 at night. When I confronted her, she didn't even deny it, just shrugged and said she'd use that money to pay debts, and that her parents knew that could happen. I told her that was theft, and she told me to leave, to stop causing drama. I went back to Chicago feeling devastated but also furious. I told Ryan everything, and he suggested I talk to a lawyer, that maybe my grandparents could sue. At first, I thought it was too extreme, that I didn't want to cause more problems. But then I called my grandfather Ralph and told him what I'd discovered. He was silent for a long moment and then told me yes, that he knew my mom hadn't used that money for me, that they'd been trying for years to get her to pay them back without success. Same with my paternal grandparents. They'd been asking for the money for years, and my dad just made excuses. I suggested they sue, and they hesitated at first because, they're their children and it's complicated to sue your own family. But in the end, they decided to do it because they needed that money, and because they were tired of being used. They hired a lawyer, all 4 grandparents together, and filed separate lawsuits against my parents. The lawyer told them they had a solid case because they had all the documentation, the checks, the emails, everything. What happened next was basically chaos. My parents received the lawsuit notifications and went into total panic. My mom called me crying, telling me how could I have done this to her, that I was her son and should be on her side. I told her she hadn't acted like a mother in years, that this was a consequence of her own actions. My dad sent me super aggressive text messages, calling me a traitor and saying he was never going to talk to me again. I responded, "Promise?" and blocked him. The thing is, the lawsuits didn't just affect my parents legally, they also destroyed their new marriages. Dennis, my mom's husband, found out about the whole legal mess and that my mom had basically robbed her own parents and decided he didn't want to be married to someone like that. He divorced her like 2 months after the lawsuit started. Carolyn, my dad's wife, did the same thing. Apparently, she thought my dad was a decent person. And when she found out about everything, she was disgusted and asked for a divorce. My parents also lost their jobs because the legal stress made their performance drop, and because in a small town everyone finds out about everything, and my parents suddenly were the people who stole from their own elderly parents. The case took like 4 months to resolve. In the end, a settlement was reached before going to trial. My parents had to sell their cars, some valuable things. They had to take out loans to be able to pay what they owed. My paternal grandparents received the $25,000 plus interest. It ended up being like $32,000. My maternal grandparents received the $20,000 plus interest, like $26,000, plus my parents had to write formal apologies, admitting what they'd done. I received copies of those apology letters, and they were basically super cold and legal. Nothing sincere, just complying with the terms of the settlement. Like a month ago, my grandparents called me and told me my parents wanted to meet with me, that they wanted to try to fix things. Honestly, I didn't want to see them, but my grandparents asked me to consider it, to do it for them. I agreed to meet at the diner where my mom used to work. She doesn't work there anymore. They fired her. It was super awkward, like the kind of awkwardness you can feel physically. My parents arrived separately, sat on opposite sides of the table, didn't talk to each other. They both looked terrible, gaunt, older than I remembered. My mom tried to talk first, saying she was so sorry for everything that had happened, that she'd been in a dark place financially and made bad decisions. My dad said something similar, that he was sorry and hoped we could rebuild our relationship. I just listened without saying much. When they finished talking, I told them I appreciated the apologies, but I wasn't going to pretend everything was okay. I told them they'd had years to be good parents, and chose not to be, that they hadn't invited me to their weddings, that they'd called me a mistake and part of the past, that they'd robbed me and my grandparents. I told them that maybe someday I could forgive them, but that day wasn't today, and probably wouldn't be soon. My mom started crying, and my dad just stared at his coffee without saying anything. I got up, left money for my part of the bill even though I hadn't eaten anything, and left. I drove back to Chicago that same night. I couldn't stay in that town one more second. Now I keep regular contact with my grandparents. I visit them when I can. I help them financially when they need something because I finally have a stable job. My parents try to call me from time to time, but I don't answer very often. I don't know if I'll ever have a real relationship with them. Honestly, I'm not sure I want one. Ryan tells me it's okay to feel that way, that I don't have to forgive just because they're my parents. I guess he's right. Last week, my grandfather Lawrence called to tell me they'd used part of the settlement money to fix the farm roof that had been leaking for years. He asked me when I was going to visit them again. I told him I'd go in 2 weeks, that I'd spend the whole weekend with them. That's enough for now, I guess. I have my grandparents. I have Ryan. I have a life in Chicago that I built on my own. My parents had their chance to be part of my life, and they wasted it. That's their loss, not mine.